And welcome back to our continued coverage of TIA 2015 Network of the Future Conference. Joining us now to discuss the net neutrality debate is Kathy Grillo. She's Senior Vice President of Federal Regulatory and Legal Affairs at Verizon. Also joining us is Joan Marsh. She's Vice President of Federal Regulatory Affairs at AT&T. And Kathy and Joan, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for being here. Of course, we're talking about the net neutrality debate. Certainly at least a couple of viewpoints on this debate. Some misunderstandings as well. Joan, I'll start with you. Where are these misunderstandings falling into place?
Well, net neutrality has been discussed inside D.C. for over a decade. And I think where there's strong agreement is on the core principles that all of our companies abide with in terms of ensuring our customers have an open internet experience. We don't block content. We facilitate the exchange of all lawful content. And we try to be very transparent in our network practices so our customers understand what network practices may affect their experience. Where there has been division, particularly in this last round of the debate, is how the FCC is going to embody those principles, codify those principles, and enforce them. And I think that the challenge became significant when the FCC turned to a very old regulatory framework that Kathy can address a little bit to try to impose regulations on the broadband space that didn't previously exist.
Yes, so this issue, I think, because it has gotten so much attention and what people see is sort of the conflict and the problems that have gone on between the different parties, what we've missed is that there's actually a lot of agreement, as Joan mentioned, about the core principles, like she said. And I think it's important to note that it's not just a philosophical principle that we want an open internet because that's important or there's some principle involved. It's because our businesses demand it. So Verizon, for instance, we've been divesting our network assets. We've been investing in over-the-top and telematics services that customers need the ability to go over someone else's network to be able to get our product and services. So for us, from a business perspective, we have to be open. And the internet is going to be open regardless of what the court does or what the FCC does. But despite all that agreement, sort of what the ISPs and the industry are focused on, we have a situation now where the FCC has adopted a regulatory framework that was actually first adopted in 1934. So this is what they call Title II. It's a particular part of the Communications Act. Again, first developed in 1934 for railroads, public utilities, and the principles of that have carried through as Congress has updated the act, but they actually haven't done that since 1996. So it's been 20 years since we've had real meaningful reform of the act. So what the FCC did in its recent order is sort of back into a situation where we're using public utility common carrier regulation for the broadband industry. And that's really where the disagreement is and where the conflict is. That's where the court challenge is centered. And there's a lot of really important implications from that.
Joan, are there some legislative solutions around this net neutrality debate, and what principles does AT&T support?
So we do think that the legislative solution would be the best path. What the FCC has done in terms of the regulations it's adopted, it's created a very unstable environment where the regulations being imposed on the companies aren't clear. And that's going to have all kinds of consequences for the ability for us to run our business, to innovate new services, to make investments, and to provide customers the types of products that they want in this incredibly dynamic and innovating space. What we want is clarity, and obviously a legislative solution would drive that the best. AT&T continues, as Kathy says, same with Verizon, we continue to run our businesses consistent with the principles that were adopted by the prior FCC in 2010. It's a core part of our business. It's a fabric of how we run our business. It's part of the commitment we make to our customers. And we think that Congress could adopt a legislative solution that embodies those bright line rules that would give clear legal authority for the FCC to do enforcement around those bright line rules, provide clarity to the companies working in the space to understand what conduct is permitted and what conduct is not, and put this whole dialogue on much more stable footing.
A number of court challenges to the FCC's net neutrality rules, the FCC's net neutrality order. Certainly AT&T and Verizon are part of that. I'll start with you from Verizon's perspective. What are some of those principal challenges?
Well, so Verizon is actually not a party to the litigation individually, but we are participating in the court challenge through our trade associations. But one thing that is noteworthy about this particular proceeding is there are a number of industry associations that are filed separately, representing cable providers, big and small, representing the wireless industry, representing wireline companies, and actually also representing sort of smaller wireless, fixed wireless providers who serve, really rural areas with a small number of customers. So big and small industry players have filed suit. And right now, where things stand is the industries have filed and they've actually asked the court to stay the portion of the order that, as I described before, sort of reverts back to this common carrier public utility type regulation. And that's where things stand now. So we'll see. We'll get a decision, in the next couple weeks, most likely, but that's where that stands.
And AT&T not working, or not particular to the litigation, but working with associations as well?
We are working with associations. We are also a named party in the litigation. And the reason why we chose to be a named party, which is different than the posture we took, this is the third time to the courts with this issue. In the prior iterations of this debate with FCC orders, we did not participate individually because we felt the prior iterations, particularly the order that was adopted in 2010, excuse me, did represent a compromise that tried to sort of take into consideration the competing arguments and tried to issue an order that was a compromise to the issue and that provided clarity to the industry. By contrast, the order we have now, which is based on this old regulatory framework and is enormously unclear in terms of the regulatory obligations it creates, is a very, very different animal. And that's why we chose to join this litigation directly, in addition to working with others in the industry through associations.
Kathy, I want to talk about how industry and the FCC's relationship may be changing in light of this net neutrality debate.
Well, I think it's interesting. It's an interesting question because I think the real question in terms of what you're asking is what is the industry now? So who are the stakeholders that are going to go to the FCC and make arguments on some of these issues? Because the industry is changing so dramatically. So now what we're facing is a regulatory regime that's not only outdated, but is really focused on only on a specific segment of a very dynamic and very competitive marketplace where different players are competing with different, Google now is offering fiber networks, is going to get into the wireless business. People are communicating through Facebook and Vine and WhatsApp and not through traditional wireless or wireline services. So we have this dynamic different industry, and so who really are, when the FCC decides it's going to issue rules under some of these statutes, where do you look? Do you only look at this narrow segment of companies that are, part of the ecosystem but not the entire thing? Or do you look at the sort of totality of the industry and decide, where it makes sense to step in and maybe better where it makes sense to step out and let the competitive dynamic, take its place?
And I think part of the challenge, too, particularly because we're relying on such an old framework, is the FCC only has legal authority to look to certain entities. There's a lot of participants, industry participants in this ecosystem now, which quite frankly the FCC doesn't have authority over. And I think that's part of the challenge of turning to such old legislation while we are building and looking toward the next generation of networks. There's a complete disconnect between the FCC's authority and what it tried to do in Title II versus who are the participants in the industry right now. And again, I think that requires Congress to take a look and try to sort this out and come up with a new regulatory framework that's appropriate for the 21st century and 21st century networks.
Joan, what is the net neutrality debate or the implications for the debate over net neutrality? What are those implications overseas, let's say in big markets like India or China?
We think they're significant. So what the FCC did was they focused very narrowly, again, on entities that they have traditionally regulated, and their regulatory scheme really applies to broadband access providers, which is just a very small slice of the industry that participates in the internet, in the provision of broadband service, and in the IP infrastructure that's now prevalent today. I don't think that overseas regulators are going to be so narrow in their focus. For example, I read a story just last week about the EU considering whether search engines should be separated from or unbundled from commercial services. That would have enormous implications for other players in this space, not necessarily AT&T, but many of our partners and other players in the space. So I think really what the United States has done here with this regulatory regime is invite other countries to consider other regulatory regimes, and I don't think that those regimes will necessarily be as narrowly tailored as what the FCC adopted here.
Yeah, that's an important point.
Kathy, implications overseas, anything you want to add?
Well, just that, again, the U.S. for the last 20 years has, on a bipartisan basis, advocated really a hands-off approach to the internet and to broadband. And the recent action is a pretty serious departure from that. And it is going to be challenging, I think, for the government to be arguing internationally that governments should not engage in heavy-handed regulation of the internet while, also looking domestically at what was done here. I think it's going to be tough.
Any reprieve? You guys think any reprieve on this? These opposing views on net neutrality anytime soon, or is this going to go on for a number of years? Joan, I'll start with you.
Well, I think it has become sort of ideological for many people in the debate right now. And understand, too, what we have achieved here goes well beyond net neutrality. Or what the FCC has done here moves well beyond the core principles of net neutrality and imposes new regulations on multiple aspects of our business that go well beyond what the original debate started as. So the debate has expanded, and it really is now a question of what kind of authority the FCC should have over the internet writ large. I don't think we see stability in this space until Congress acts. Even if the court acts, we've seen what happens when the court acts. They render a decision, and the whole debate goes back to the FCC,
exactly
and
right.
It's going to be deja vu all over again. And given how religious people have come on this issue, I don't see any magical compromise coming up anytime soon. So I do think that the reprieve comes with congressional action.
So speaking of magical compromise, looking through your crystal ball, if you will, if Congress does act, how will this shake out? What kind of timeline are we looking at?
I'm certainly not going to predict what Congress might do. We are going to continue to engage in our dialogue with members of Congress. I know they're being very thoughtful about this right now, and I think the parties are also had some dialogue about this. So I know it's at least on their agenda to review and consider. I don't have any idea if they have any short-term plans to move anything in Congress, but we will continue the dialogue. We do think that Congress could go back and look at the compromise that was reached in 2010, which contained a series of bright line rules to ensure customers that the internet would remain open, and we think that there's a solution where they could codify that approach to ensure the folks that are committed to an open internet that will remain open, and to provide sound legal footing for the FCC to move forward on those principles.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. We're in this period of uncertainty, and I think that's probably going to be the state that we're in for some time. I mean, I do know from Verizon's perspective, whatever happens in the court, whatever happens in Congress, we're going to make sure that we are promoting and protecting an open internet. We're going to be giving our customers, exactly what they want, which is access to, any content, any application, any website of their choice. So that's not going to change. But until we have, I think, some certainty from Congress, regardless of what the court does, we're going to be in this period where we're just going to have to, muddle through and do the best we can.
Kathy and Joan, I know TIA, or speaking on behalf of TIA, I know that we were very happy to have both of you on a keynote, or a panel rather, just earlier. We are very happy to have you on the stage here, and you gave us your time. I know you have to get back to where you're from. I think we're all from the Washington area, is that right? Okay,
yes,
that makes sense. Thanks for your time, and we'll talk again, I'm sure.
Thanks,
Thank
Abe.
you.
All right, appreciate it. Thank you. And for all of TIA Now's coverage of TIA 2015 Network of the Future, please log on to tianow.org. So long.